Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the scorching sun and dusty streets of ancient Sumer, around 2500 BC, a world where human lives were bought and sold like cattle, where fortunes were made from misery, and where survival meant making choices that would haunt civilized society for millennia. We're diving into the brutal reality of being a slave trader in humanity's first cities. Forget the sanitized history lessons. The truth, you probably wouldn't last a month in this business without losing either your life or your soul. The competition was cutthroat, the profit margins razor thin, and one bad deal could see you chained up alongside your own merchandise. So before we enter this moral wasteland together, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready for some seriously dark truths about human nature. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It's incredible to see who's brave enough to explore these shadowy corners of history with me. Now dim those lights. Maybe grab something strong to drink. Picture the mud brick walls of ancient Lagash rising from the desert. Hear the bleating of goats mixing with human cries in the marketplace. And let's step into this nightmare together, the story of what it really meant to traffic in human souls when the world was young. Congratulations, you've just woken up in a cramped, sweltering room above a pottery workshop in the city of Lagash, and you are now one of the most despised yet necessary professionals in all of Sumer. You're a slave trader, and today, like every day, your livelihood depends on human suffering. The first thing that hits you as consciousness returns isn't the brutal heat already building at dawn, but the smell, a subtle blend of stale beer, human sweat, goat dung, and something you pray isn't decomposing flesh from the holding pens behind the market. This is your world now, the gray area between civilization and barbarism, where profit and cruelty dance together like lovers in the shadows. Your bedroom, and we're using that term generously, consists of a raised clay platform covered with scratchy wool blankets, a few clay vessels for water and beer, and a locked wooden chest containing your most precious possessions, your bronze scales for weighing silver, your collection of cylinder seals for marking contracts, and a wickedly sharp copper dagger that saved your life more times than you care to remember. As you stretch and feel your joints crack, sleeping on clay platforms will do that to you. You can already hear the sounds of the city stirring to life. Somewhere below, your landlord is firing up his pottery kiln, filling the air with smoke that makes your eyes water. Outside, farmers are driving their long-haired sheep through the narrow streets, their bells clanging in a rhythm that would drive a modern person insane within hours. But you're not a modern person. You're a survivor in an age when human life was cheap and opportunities for advancement were rare. You've carved out your niche in one of humanity's oldest and most morally questionable professions. And despite what you tell yourself, deep down you know there's blood on your hands. The morning routine begins the same way it always does. You splash lukewarm water on your face from a clay bowl, rinse your mouth with weak beer because the water isn't safe to drink, and check your appearance in a polished copper mirror. Looking professional matters in this business. Buyers want to deal with someone who appears successful, not some desperate street vendor. Your clothing marks you as a man of some means but not nobility. You wear a wool kilt dyed with expensive blue indigo, leather sandals with bronze clasps, and a thin copper torque around your neck that glints in the early morning light. These aren't just fashion choices, they're advertisements. Every potential client needs to see that you're successful enough to be trusted with large transactions, but not so wealthy that they can't afford your services. The reflection staring back at you from that copper mirror shows a man in his 30s with prematurely grey streaks in his black hair. The stress of this business ages you fast. Your hands are soft compared to a farmer's but stained with ink from contracts, and scarred from the occasional negotiation that got physical. Your eyes hold the calculating look of someone who's learned to see people as commodities, and if you're honest with yourself, you barely recognize the idealistic young man who first came to the city seeking his fortune. But there's no time for philosophical reflection. Business waits for no one, and in the slave trade, timing is everything. A delay of even a few hours could mean the difference between profit and catastrophe. You grab your leather satchel containing your scales, seals, and writing materials, check that your dagger is properly concealed beneath your kilt, and head downstairs to begin another day of turning human misery into silver. Your first stop is always the holding compound behind the main marketplace, a fenced area that serves as temporary housing for your inventory. The guards you've hired recognize your approach and nod respectfully. These aren't the brightest men in Lagash, but they're loyal, and more importantly, they're not squeamish about their work. In this business, a strong stomach is more valuable than a sharp mind. The first of the holding compound is a testament to human ingenuity applied to human cruelty. Clay brick walls, topped with sharp pottery shards, create an enclosure about the size of a modern tennis court. Inside, roughly built reed shelters provide minimal protection from the sun and rain. A single well provides water, and a trench along one side serves as a latrine. Though serves might be too generous a word. This morning you have about 30 pieces of merchandise in various states of readiness for sale. Some are recent acquisitions still bearing the bruises and shock of capture, while others have been conditioned, taught basic Sumerian phrases, cleaned up, and prepared for the more discriminating buyers who prefer their slaves to arrive already broken in. The newest arrivals catch your attention first. A family captured just 3 days ago during a raid on a mountain village, a man, his pregnant wife, and 2 children who can't be more than 10 years old. They huddled together in the shade of one of the shelters, the man's eyes burning with a hatred that would unsettle you if you hadn't seen it 1,000 times before. His wife rocks back and forth, her hands protectively covering her swollen belly, while the children cling to her sides like terrified animals. You've been in this business long enough to read people like scrolls. The man is a fighter. You can see it in the set of his shoulders and the way his eyes track every movement in the compound. He'll need extra supervision and probably won't sell well unless he's destined for hard labor where his defiant spirit can be properly crushed. The woman, on the other hand, is already broken. The vacant look in her eyes tells you she's retreated somewhere deep inside herself, where the world can't touch her. Pregnant female slaves are actually quite valuable. You're essentially selling 2 people for the price of 1, and babies born into slavery cause fewer problems than those who remember freedom. The children, however, present a different challenge entirely. Young slaves are valuable because they can be trained from an early age, but these 2 are old enough to remember their home and young enough to be traumatized by the experience. They'll need careful handling if they're going to be profitable rather than problematic. Moving through the compound, you make mental notes about each piece of merchandise. There's the teenage girl captured 2 weeks ago, who's finally stopped crying constantly. She'll make an excellent household servant for a wealthy family. The scarred warrior from a rival city-state, who was sold to you by his own people after a failed rebellion. He's strong as an ox, but will require a buyer who knows how to handle dangerous slaves. The elderly scribe who got into debt and sold himself to pay it off. Educated slaves are always in demand, but you'll need to verify his literacy before setting a price. But your attention keeps returning to your newest acquisition, a young man about 20 years old with the calloused hands of a craftsman. But he was brought to you yesterday by one of your regular suppliers, a raid leader who specializes in quick strikes on isolated workshops and farms. This boy was apparently apprenticed to a metal worker before his capture, which makes him extremely valuable. Skilled artisans are the luxury goods of the slave trade. You approach him slowly, noting how he shrinks back against the clay wall. Good, he's already learning fear. Fear is the foundation of obedience, and obedience is what makes slaves valuable. You speak to him in simple Sumerian, testing his comprehension. He understands basic commands but clearly hasn't learned the language properly yet. That's fine. You have a woman who specializes in teaching new slaves the essentials they'll need to function in Sumerian society. You say, pointing at the young metal worker, "What work do you do?" His answer comes in a dialect you barely understand, but you catch enough words to confirm what you already suspected. This boy knows how to work copper and bronze, skills that could make him worth 20 or 30 shekels to the right buyer. But first, he needs to be properly prepared for sale, and that means undergoing the breaking-in process that transforms wild mountain people into useful slaves. The process of converting free humans into obedient slaves is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of your profession, and you've developed it into a science. It's not enough to simply capture people and throw them in chains. Raw captives are rebellious, dangerous, and likely to flee at the first opportunity. They need to be psychologically transformed, their sense of identity crushed and rebuilt around a single principle: absolute obedience to their owners. You've learned that the process works best when you break down the slave's connection to their old life, while simultaneously making them dependent on you for survival. It starts with the basics: food, water, and shelter, all controlled by you and your employees. Slaves eat when you decide they eat, drink when you allow them to drink, and sleep where you tell them to sleep. This creates a fundamental dependency that gradually erodes their sense of autonomy. Language is another crucial tool. New slaves are forbidden from speaking in their native tongues and are punished for failing to respond to Sumerian commands. You have a former slave named Nima who serves as your language instructor. She was once captured from the same mountain region as many of your current slaves, but years of conditioning have made her more loyal to you than to her own people. She understands their languages and can speed up the process of teaching them basic Sumerian. The psychological techniques are more subtle but equally effective. You've learned to identify the relationships between your slaves and use them as leverage. The man with a pregnant wife, for example, will do anything to ensure she receives adequate food and medical care. His love for her has become a chain more effective than any bronze shackle. Similarly, parents will endure any humiliation if it means their children are spared punishment. You watch as Nima works with a group of recent acquisitions, teaching them the phrases they'll need to know. Yes, Master, I understand. I will obey, and please forgive me. She repeats these phrases over and over while the slaves respond in chorus, their voices gradually losing the defiant edge that marked their first days in captivity. The most effective part of the process, however, is what you call privilege management. Slaves who show signs of accepting their situation receive small rewards: a bit of food, cleaner water, a blanket on cold nights. Those who resist face increasingly harsh punishments until compliance becomes their only path to survival. You found that most people will abandon their principles surprisingly quickly when the alternative is genuine suffering. But breaking slaves isn't just about cruelty, it's about creating a product that buyers actually want. A slave who still dreams of freedom is a liability. A slave who might run away or rebel is worthless. Your job is to create human beings who genuinely believe that serving their masters is their natural state, and that requires a careful balance of punishment and reward that destroys hope while preserving function. The young metalworker is responding well to the process. After 3 days of controlled deprivation, followed by small kindnesses when he shows compliance, he's already beginning to address you with the proper respectful terms. His shoulders have lost some of their defiant set, and yesterday you caught him actually thanking Nima for his meager ration of barley porridge. He's becoming a slave, and soon he'll be ready to sell. The slave market opens 2 hours after dawn, when the morning heat is still tolerable and the wealthy buyers are making their rounds. The market itself is a dedicated section of Lagesh's main commercial district, marked by wooden posts where chains can be attached and clay platforms where merchandise can be displayed for inspection. You arrive early to secure the best spots. Location matters as much in the slave trade as it does in any other business. The prime positions are near the market's entrance where the wealthiest buyers will see your slaves first, but these spots command premium fees that cut into your profit margins. You've learned to balance visibility with costs, choosing positions that give you access to your target customers without breaking your budget. Setting up your display is an art form in itself. Slaves need to be arranged to highlight their best features while concealing their flaws. The young metalworker gets a prominent position where buyers can see his strong hands and sturdy build. The slaves did bakte or their cycle videos. This not benti too white for the fiction trest of buyers. If meta you've fought best to at Benjen. You've had him cleaned and given him a decent kilt to wear. Presentation matters when you're trying to justify a high asking price. Long, the pregnant woman presents a more complex marketing challenge. Pregnancy adds value but also risk. Buyers worry about complications during childbirth that could result in losing both mother and child. You position her where the roundedness of her belly is visible but not overwhelming, and you've prepared a story about her health and previous successful births that may or may not be true. The first customers of the day are usually household managers representing wealthy families. These buyers know what they're looking for and have the authority to make immediate purchases, but they're also the most demanding. They'll inspect your slaves like livestock, checking teeth, muscles, and reflexes to ensure they're getting healthy specimens. They'll ask detailed questions about each slave's background, skills, and temperament, and they can spot lies with the expertise of professional negotiators. This one, says a stern-faced woman pointing at your young metalworker. What's his experience with bronze? You launch into your prepared sales pitch, embellishing the boy's credentials while staying just close enough to the truth to avoid obvious deception. Yes, he was apprenticed to a master craftsman. Yes, he knows the proper techniques for alloy mixing. No, he's never shown any signs of violent behavior. The woman listens with the practiced skepticism of someone who's been burned by dishonest dealers before. She runs her hands along the boy's arms, feeling for muscle tone and examining his palms for the characteristic calluses of a metalworker. She checks his eyes for signs of disease and his teeth for evidence of malnutrition. Finally, she steps back and announces her verdict. 15 shekels. You nearly choke on your own saliva. 15 shekels? This boy is worth at least 25, maybe 30 to the right buyer, but arguing too aggressively might scare her off entirely. And 15 shekels is still a respectable profit considering you paid only 3 shekels for him to the raid leader who brought him in. Go 20 shekels. You counter, trying to sound confident but not greedy. He's young, healthy, and already partially trained. You won't find better metalworking skills anywhere in the market today. The negotiation that follows is a delicate dance of bluff and counter-bluff. She points out supposed flaws in the boy's build and questions whether his skills are really as advanced as you claim. You highlight his obvious strengths and casually mention that another buyer showed interest earlier. A complete lie, but she doesn't know that. But she doesn't know that. Eventually, you settle on 18 shekels, not your dream price, but a solid profit that will keep you fed and housed for several weeks. The actual transaction involves more ceremony than you might expect. The buyer produces her scales and carefully measures out 18 shekels of silver, checking each piece for purity and proper weight. You respond by producing your cylinder seal and pressing it into a wet clay tablet that records the sale, the price, and the guarantee that the slave is healthy and not stolen property. Another lie, but a necessary one for legal protection. As the metalworker is led away in chains by his new owner, you feel the familiar mixture of satisfaction and unease that follows every sale. Satisfaction because you've just made a profit that will support you for weeks. Unease because you've just watched a human being disappear into a life of bondage. And some small part of you that remembers being a decent person feels sick about it. The slave trade in Lagash isn't a profession for the faint of heart, partly because of the moral implications, but mostly because of the competition. You're operating in a market saturated with dealers ranging from sophisticated merchants with connections to the royal palace all the way down to desperate street vendors selling children they've kidnapped from the poorest districts. At the top of the hierarchy are the palace-connected dealers who have exclusive contracts to supply slaves for major public works projects. These merchants deal in volume minus hundreds of slaves at a time for canal digging, temple construction, and military campaigns. They have the capital to purchase entire villages and the political connections to avoid awkward questions about their methods. You're not in their league and never will be. Below them are the established merchants like yourself, professional dealers with regular suppliers, holding facilities and customer bases. You compete mainly on price and quality, trying to offer better value than your rivals while maintaining enough profit margin to stay in business. This is where most of the market action happens, and it's where reputations are made and destroyed. Your main competitor in this tier is a weasel-faced man named Enlil Bani, who operates from a compound near the temple district. He's been in the business longer than you have and has built up a network of suppliers that gives him first pick of the best merchandise. What's worse, he's not above sabotaging his competitors through spreading rumors about their slaves' health or bribing guards to release competitors' inventory accidentally. Accidentally. You learned this the hard way 6 months ago, when a shipment of prime slaves mysteriously developed symptoms of the sweating sickness just days before a major auction. The symptoms were suspiciously mild and disappeared as soon as the slaves were moved to a different location, but not before Enlil Bani's agents had spread word throughout the market that you were selling diseased merchandise. It took weeks to rebuild your reputation and cost you several important customers. At the bottom of the hierarchy are the desperate small-timers who kidnap children and elderly people from the streets and try to sell them quickly before anyone notices they're missing. These amateurs undercut everyone's prices and flood the market with low-quality merchandise that gives the entire profession a bad reputation. They're also the ones most likely to get caught and executed, which occasionally opens up opportunities for more professional dealers like yourself. The key to surviving in this competitive environment is developing reliable supplier relationships. You've cultivated contacts with several raid leaders who specialize in quick strikes on isolated settlements. These men understand that you pay fair prices promptly and don't ask inconvenient questions about their methods. In return, they give you first choice of their captives and occasionally tip you off about particularly valuable targets. Your best supplier is a gnarled veteran warrior named Lugali, who commands a band of 20 professional raiders. He's been running expeditions into the hill country for over a decade and has developed the perfect system: fast strikes on small villages, quick retreat before organized resistance can form, and immediate transport of captives to buyers in the city. He delivers fresh slaves to your compound every 2 weeks like clockwork, but even reliable supplies can be problematic. Last month, Lugali brought you a batch of slaves that included the teenage daughter of a minor mountain chieftain. You didn't know about her parentage until her father arrived at the city gates with 50 armed warriors demanding her return. The situation nearly escalated into open warfare before the city officials managed to negotiate a ransom payment that ate up 3 months of your profits. This is the reality of the slave trade. You're always walking a tightrope between profit and disaster, trying to maximize your income while avoiding the kind of catastrophic mistakes that could get you killed, imprisoned, or bankrupted. Every transaction carries risks that could destroy your business overnight, and every day brings new competitors trying to steal your suppliers, your customers, or your inventory. Your clientele represents a cross-section of Sumerian society's upper tiers, each with their own specific needs and purchasing patterns. Understanding these customers is crucial to your survival. Sell the wrong slave to the wrong buyer, and you might find yourself facing angry demands for refunds, legal action, or worse. Wealthy households represent your bread and butter customers. These families need domestic servants, agricultural workers, and craftsmen to maintain their estates and business interests. They prefer slaves who are young, healthy, and preferably already trained in relevant skills. They'll pay premium prices for quality merchandise, but expect guarantees about health, temperament, and abilities. The most demanding household customers are the wives of successful merchants who manage large domestic operations. These women know exactly what they want and aren't shy about expressing their displeasure when slaves fail to meet their expectations. You learn this lesson painfully when you sold a supposedly experienced cook to the household of a textile merchant. The woman couldn't actually cook anything more complex than barley porridge, and her new mistress returned her 3 days later demanding a full refund and threatening to spread word about your dishonesty. Religious institutions form another important customer base, though they're often the most hypocritical. Temples need workers for construction projects, agricultural operations, and various menial tasks. The priests always insist on slaves who are morally pure, whatever that means, and prefer to purchase from dealers who at least pretend to be legitimate businessmen rather than obvious criminals. But the Temple of Nin-Hersag recently purchased 6 slaves from you for their extensive gardens and livestock operations. The head priest made a great show of blessing the transaction and asking the goddess to look favorably upon your business, apparently forgetting that the slaves in question had been captured during a raid that left their village burned to the ground and their families dead. But your most lucrative customers are the construction foremen working on major public projects. These men need large numbers of strong workers for canal digging, wall building, and other heavy labor. They don't care about the slaves' backgrounds or skills, they just want bodies that can lift heavy loads and won't die too quickly from overwork. The downside of these bulk sales is that construction work is essentially a death sentence for slaves. The combination of backbreaking labor, minimal food, and dangerous working conditions means that most slaves sold for construction projects survive less than 2 years. You've learned not to think too hard about what happens to your merchandise after the sale, but sometimes you can't avoid seeing the results. Last week, you encountered a gang of construction slaves working on a new section of the city wall. Among them was a man you'd sold 6 months earlier, a farmer captured during a border raid who'd left behind a wife and children. He'd lost so much weight that you barely recognized him, and the hopeless look in his eyes made it clear that he knew he was never going home. He didn't acknowledge you when you passed by, but you caught him staring with an expression that haunted your dreams for days. The most dangerous customers are the private individuals who purchase slaves for questionable purposes. Some buyers are obviously planning to use their purchases for sexual purposes, particularly when they're specifically requesting young, attractive slaves of either gender. Others hint at plans for human sacrifice or other ritual uses that you prefer not to think about too deeply. You've developed a policy of not asking too many questions about buyers' intentions. Partly because you don't want to know the answers, and partly because being too curious about customers' business is a good way to lose customers. But sometimes the implications are so obvious that even willful ignorance can't protect you from understanding what you're enabling. The worst transaction you've ever completed involved selling a pair of children, brothers aged 8 and 10, to a man who claimed he needed them for domestic assistance. Something about his manner and the specific way he examined the boys made your skin crawl. But he was offering 3 times the normal price, and you needed the money to pay off a debt to one of Enlabani's enforcers. You took the silver and tried to forget the transaction. But sometimes you still wake up wondering what happened to those boys. Operating in the slave trade isn't just morally challenging, it's physically dangerous. You're dealing with desperate people on both sides of every transaction, handling large amounts of silver that attract thieves, and operating in legal grey areas that leave you vulnerable to both criminals and officials. Your daily routine involves constant risk assessment and threat management. Every morning, you check your compound for signs of attempted break-ins or sabotage. Your guards are armed and trained to kill anyone who tries to steal your merchandise or harm you. But guards can be bribed, intimidated, or simply overwhelmed by superior numbers. The slaves themselves represent a constant threat. No matter how thoroughly broken they seem, there's always the possibility that one of them will snap and try to kill you or escape. You've learned to read the warning signs, the way someone's eyes track your movements, sudden changes in behavior patterns, whispered conversations between slaves from the same region. 3 months ago, that nearly happened when the scarred warrior slave you've been holding attempted to organize a mass escape. He'd been quietly working on the other slaves, convincing them that they could overpower the guards and fight their way out of the city. You only discovered the plot because one of your broken slaves, a woman who'd been conditioned to inform on the others, reported the conspiracy. The punishment you inflicted was deliberately brutal and public. The warrior was beaten unconscious, chained to a post in the center of the compound, and left without food or water for 3 days while the other slaves were forced to watch. When he finally broke down and begged for mercy, you had him whipped until he screamed promises of absolute obedience. It was theater as much as punishment, a demonstration that resistance was not just futile, but counterproductive. Legal threats are more subtle, but equally dangerous. The slave trade operates in a complex web of regulations, taxes, and official corruption that changes according to the political winds. What's legal today might be criminal tomorrow. If the wrong official decides your business, threatens their interests, or if you fail to pay the right bribes to the right people. You maintain relationships with several mid-level officials who can provide advance warning about policy changes or investigations that might affect your business. These relationships are expensive. They expect regular gifts of silver, merchandise, or information, but they're essential for survival. Last year, one of your contacts warned you about a surprise inspection just hours before officials raided your compound. Without that warning, they would have discovered that half your slaves had been stolen from allied cities, which would have meant imprisonment or execution. The most persistent threat comes from your competitors, particularly Enlabani and his network of associates. The slave trade attracts ruthless people who don't hesitate to use violence to eliminate competition or collect debts. You've survived 2 attempts on your life and know that more will likely follow as long as you remain profitable enough to be worth killing. Your personal security routine involves varying your daily patterns, traveling with armed guards whenever possible, and maintaining multiple safe houses where you can hide if necessary. Your main residence is fortified with thick walls, iron-reinforced doors, and guards who sleep in shifts. You never travel the same route twice in a row, never meet clients in isolated locations, and always carry enough silver to buy your way out of trouble. But perhaps the greatest threat to your survival isn't physical, it's psychological. The constant stress of operating in a morally bankrupt profession while surrounded by violence and desperation is slowly eating away at your sanity. You drink more than you used to, sleep poorly, and find yourself becoming increasingly paranoid and emotionally numb. Sometimes you catch yourself looking at free people and automatically calculating their potential value as slaves. You've started thinking of human beings primarily in terms of their market price rather than their inherent worth. This transformation terrifies you more than any physical threat because you're beginning to suspect that you're becoming something monstrous, not just someone who trades in slaves, but someone who has internalized the mindset that makes slavery possible. After 2 years in the slave trade, you've accumulated more wealth than you ever imagined possible, but you're beginning to understand why so few people stay in this business for very long. The psychological toll of treating human beings as merchandise is crushing. Even for someone who started with flexible moral standards, your financial success is undeniable. You now own your building outright rather than renting space above the pottery workshop. Your compound has been expanded to hold twice as many slaves, and you've hired additional guards and support staff. Your personal possessions include fine clothing, jewelry, quality weapons, and enough silver to buy your way into the merchant class if you ever decide to leave the slave trade. But wealth comes with its own problems. Success has made you a target for thieves, competitors, and officials who want larger bribes. Your expanded operation requires more careful management and creates more opportunities for catastrophic failures. The more slaves you hold, the greater the risk of disease outbreaks, escape attempts, or other disasters that could wipe out months of profit in a single day. More troubling is what success has done to your relationships with other people. Free citizens view you with a mixture of revulsion and fear. They need your services but don't want to be associated with you socially. Your family disowned you months ago when word of your profession reached your home village. You have no close friends because friendship requires trust, and people who traffic in human misery can't be trusted with anything important. Your romantic life has become particularly complicated. Free women won't marry a slave trader, and the enslaved women in your compound can't provide genuine companionship since any relationship would be fundamentally coercive. You've had brief affairs with prostitutes and tavern workers, but these encounters are hollow and transactional, just another form of commerce in a life that's become entirely about buying and selling. For on the offensive, the isolation is beginning to affect your judgment. When you have no one to talk to except guards, suppliers, and customers who share your moral flexibility, it becomes easy to rationalize increasingly questionable decisions. Last month, you accepted a commission to kidnap the children of a merchant who defaulted on a debt to one of your customers. The job paid well, but it crossed a line from trading in slaves to actively creating them. Multiculturally questionable decisions, the shelf to good. Sleep has become elusive as your conscience wars with your practical need to survive in a brutal profession. You're haunted by memories of particular slaves whose suffering was especially visible. The pregnant woman who miscarried after being separated from her husband. The young boy who stopped speaking entirely after witnessing his parents' execution. The elderly man who died of despair within days of his capture. But what disturbs you most is how easily you've adapted to these horrors. The first time you saw a slave beaten unconscious, you vomited and couldn't eat for hours. Now you can watch similar scenes while calculating whether the punishment will affect the slave's market value. This transformation from someone who was horrified by cruelty to someone who perpetrates it as a matter of routine has happened so gradually that you barely noticed it occurring. The question that keeps you awake at night isn't whether what you're doing is wrong. You know it is. The question is whether you've become so corrupted by this business that redemption is no longer possible. Can someone who has spent years reducing human beings to their economic value ever learn to see people as people again? Or have you passed some invisible point of no return that makes you permanently part of the machinery of oppression? Everything changes on a sweltering morning in late summer when Lugali arrives at your compound with his latest catch. Instead of his usual mixture of adults and adolescents, this shipment consists entirely of children, 12 boys and girls ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 14. They've been marched for days through the desert heat, and several show signs of severe dehydration and exhaustion. Mountain Village got too close to one of our regular routes. Lugali explains with casual indifference. Adults fought too hard, so we had to kill most of them. Kids were easier to manage for the journey back. As you walk through the group of children, making preliminary assessments of their condition and market value, one of them catches your attention. A girl who can't be more than 8 years old, with distinctive green eyes and hair the color of desert sand. She's holding the hand of a slightly older boy who shares her features, obviously her brother, or something about her face triggers a memory that hits you like a physical blow. She looks exactly like your youngest sister did at that age. The same eyes, the same stubborn set to her jaw, the same way of standing protectively close to family members when threatened. For a moment, the professional detachment that's protected you for 2 years completely evaporates. Instead of seeing a piece of merchandise worth maybe 10 shekels to the right buyer, you see a terrified child who's just watched her parents die and been dragged away from everything she's ever known. The recognition is so overwhelming that you actually stagger backward and have to steady yourself against the compound wall. Lugali notices your reaction and misinterprets it. "Good eye," he says approvingly. "That one's prime merchandise. Young enough to train properly, old enough to be useful immediately. I'm thinking 15 shekels minimum." His words snap you back to the present, but the damage has been done. The carefully constructed psychological barriers that allowed you to function in this business have been shattered, and suddenly you're seeing all your slaves not as inventory but as people. The pregnant woman isn't a 2-for-1 sale. She's a terrified mother-to-be who's been stolen from her home. The young metal worker isn't skilled labor. He's someone's son who will never see his family again. You try to regain your composure, but it's too late. The realization of what you've become and what you've enabled crashes over you like a flood. Every slave you've sold, every family you've helped destroy, every life you've commodified adds to a weight of guilt that suddenly seems unbearable. "I need to think about pricing," you tell Lugali, your voice sounding strange and distant to your own ears. "Give me until tomorrow." He shrugs and begins arranging for the children to be processed into your holding compound. You watch as your guards separate siblings, assign sleeping spaces, and begin the routine of breaking down their resistance. The efficiency of the operation that you've spent months perfecting now seems like a perfectly designed machine for destroying souls. That night, you sit in your room staring at the locked chest that contains your profits from 2 years of slave trading. Enough silver to buy a small farm, establish a legitimate business, or simply disappear to another city where no one knows your history. But you also know that no amount of wealth can purchase absolution for what you've done, and no distance can separate you from the knowledge of the suffering you've caused. The choice you face is simple but profound. Continue in a business that's made you wealthy but cost you your humanity, or find some way to stop being the person you've become. Either path leads to destruction. Continuing will complete your moral collapse, while stopping will likely result in financial ruin and possibly physical death when your competitors and creditors realize you're getting out of the business. As dawn approaches, you realize that you've reached the breaking point that claims most slave traders eventually. The business that promised easy wealth has instead delivered a kind of spiritual death that no amount of silver can cure. The decision comes to you with the clarity that only accompanies complete desperation. You can't continue as you are, but you also can't simply walk away from the business without consequences that would likely prove fatal. Your only option is to execute one final, catastrophic transaction that will either destroy you completely or provide enough resources to disappear forever. You spend the morning making preparations that feel like planning your own funeral. First, you visit the money changers in the temple district to convert your silver reserves into more portable forms of wealth, gold jewelry, precious stones, and letters of credit that can be honored in distant cities. This process alone takes hours and attracts unwanted attention. But you need assets that can be moved quickly if your plan goes wrong. Next, you meet with your most reliable guard, a scarred veteran named Namu, who served you faithfully for over a year. You offer him enough silver to buy his own small farm in exchange for one night's work that you describe only as extremely dangerous but necessary for both our survival. He agrees without asking for details. Loyalty bought with consistent payment and fair treatment is more reliable than loyalty based on friendship or fear. The children from yesterday's delivery are still being processed in your compound, and their presence makes what you're planning feel both more urgent and more justified. You can't save all the slaves who've passed through your hands, but you might be able to save these 12 and perhaps a few others while simultaneously striking a blow against the system that created you. Your plan is audaciously simple: steal back your own merchandise and sell it to the one customer who will pay premium prices while asking no questions about provenance. The Gotian raiders who've been terrorizing the northern borders are known to purchase slaves for resale in distant markets where Sumerian law can't reach them. They pay in gold rather than silver and don't care whether the slaves they're buying were legally acquired. The irony isn't lost on you. You're planning to betray the very system you've served in order to profit from its destruction. But irony is a luxury you can no longer afford. What matters now is accumulating enough wealth to disappear, while simultaneously salving your conscience by removing these particular slaves from the Sumerian market entirely. The execution requires precise timing and ruthless efficiency. You wait until the darkest hour before dawn, when your guards are at their least alert and the city watch is focused on the main gates rather than internal movement. Using your knowledge of the compound's routines, you and Namu neutralize the guards not through violence but through a sleeping draft mixed into their late-night beer rations. Moving through the compound in absolute silence, you begin the delicate process of selecting which slaves to steal. The children are obvious choices. They represent both the highest potential value and the clearest moral imperative. But you also select the pregnant woman, the young metal worker, and several others whose faces have haunted your dreams. The logistics are nightmarish. 23 people must be moved through the city without alerting anyone to their presence, then transported to a meeting point outside the walls where Gutian buyers are waiting. You've prepared covered wagons and bribed gate guards, but a single mistake or unexpected encounter could result in disaster for everyone involved. The journey through Lagash's sleeping streets feels like walking through a fever dream. Every sound seems amplified. Every shadow potentially conceals enemies, and the constant fear of discovery makes your heart race so fast you worry it might simply stop beating. The slaves themselves seem to understand that something unusual is happening, but their conditioning prevents them from attempting escape or calling for help. At the city's northern gate, the guards you've bribed are waiting as promised. They wave your convoy through without inspection, probably assuming you're conducting some kind of early morning delivery. Once outside the walls, you feel a moment of relief that proves premature. You're still hours away from the meeting point, and dawn is approaching fast. Not the Getian buyers are waiting at the agreed location, a ruined watchtower about 10 kilometers from the city. These are hard men who've spent their lives raiding Sumerian settlements, and they examine your merchandise with the cold efficiency of professional killers. Their leader, a giant with ritual scars covering his arms, speaks broken Sumerian with an accent so thick you can barely understand him. 23 pieces, he says after completing his inspection. Condition acceptable. Price 40 talents gold. It's more money than you've ever seen in one place. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life in any city from Egypt to India. But as you watch the Guccians loading your former slaves into their own wagons, you realize that you haven't actually saved anyone. You've simply transferred them to different masters who will probably treat them even worse than Sumerian owners would have. The pregnant woman catches your eye as she's being chained into one of the Guccian wagons. For just a moment, her vacant expression clears, and she looks directly at you with an expression of such profound betrayal that you feel physically sick. She trusted you during her weeks in your compound, and now she's discovering that even that minimal relationship was a lie. As the Guccian convoy disappears into the pre-dawn darkness, you're left standing in the ruins of the watchtower with Ernamu and enough gold to buy your freedom from the slave trade forever. But freedom has turned out to be just another word for a different kind of prison, one built from guilt, isolation, and the knowledge that escape is impossible because you can never escape from yourself. The aftermath of your theft unfolds exactly as you'd predicted it would, with violence, chaos, and the complete destruction of everything you'd built over 2 years in the slave trade. By noon the next day, news of the missing slaves has spread throughout Lagash's merchant district, and every competitor, supplier, and customer you've ever dealt with knows that you've either been robbed or have betrayed the entire system. And Labani arrives at your compound before the city guards do, bringing with him a dozen armed men, an expression of barely contained rage. He's not just angry about the theft, he's furious that you've made every slave trader in the city look incompetent and untrustworthy. When buyers start questioning the security of the entire market, everyone's profits suffer. Where are they? He demands, pressing a bronze dagger against your throat hard enough to draw blood. Where are my merchandise? You stick to the story you've prepared. Unknown raiders overwhelmed your guards and made off with your entire inventory. It's not entirely false. You simply omit the detail that you are one of the raiders. Enlil Bani doesn't believe you, but he can't prove anything, and murdering you in broad daylight would attract the kind of official attention that his own business can't afford. The city guards who arrive an hour later are equally skeptical, but slightly more professional in their interrogation. They examine the compound, question the guards who claim to remember nothing after drinking their evening beer, and take detailed statements about the missing slaves. Their investigation is thorough enough to be convincing, but not thorough enough to uncover the truth. What they do discover is evidence of your financial preparations, the visits to money changers, the conversion of silver to gold, and the letters of credit that suggest you are planning to leave the city. This evidence supports their theory that you orchestrated the theft yourself, but it also suggests that you are planning to disappear, which makes pursuing the case less urgent from their perspective. Within 3 days, you've become a pariah in Lagash's commercial district. Former customers cross the street to avoid speaking with you. Suppliers refuse to do business with someone they consider either incompetent or dishonest. Even the tavern workers and prostitutes who used to welcome your silver now treat you with suspicious hostility. The isolation is so complete that you begin to understand how your former slaves must have felt when they were cut off from everything familiar and forced to rebuild their identities around new realities. You've become a different kind of slave, one chained not by bronze shackles but by reputation, guilt, and the impossibility of returning to your former life. Your guards abandon you when it becomes clear that their association with your tainted business is making them unemployable elsewhere. Your compound becomes a liability rather than an asset, a constant reminder of your crimes that attracts unwanted attention from both authorities and criminals. You're forced to sell it at a fraction of its value to a competitor who wants the location but not the reputation that comes with it. But the worst part isn't the financial losses or social isolation. It's the growing realization that your grand gesture of rebellion has accomplished nothing meaningful. The slave trade continues without you, simply adjusting to fill the gap left by your departure. New dealers emerge to serve your former customers. Fresh supplies of human misery flow into the market from the same sources you once used. Within a month, it's as if you never existed. The children you tried to save are probably dead or worse by now, worked to death in Gutian mines or sold to buyers in distant lands where Sumerian law offers no protection. The adults you liberated have simply been replaced by new captives from fresh raids on mountain villages. You've discovered the fundamental truth about systemic evil. Individual acts of conscience, no matter how dramatic or costly, can't meaningfully damage institutions that serve powerful interests. The slave trade doesn't depend on any particular dealer or even any particular group of dealers. It exists because Sumerian society wants it to exist, and it will continue as long as that demand remains unchanged. With your reputation destroyed and your former life impossible to reclaim, you face the choice that confronts all failed slave traders: death, imprisonment, or exile. You choose exile, using the gold from your final transaction to purchase safe passage to the distant city of Mari, where Sumerian law holds less sway and your reputation hasn't yet arrived. The journey north along the Euphrates takes weeks and gives you too much time to think about what you've become and what you've lost. You travel with merchant caravans for protection, but your fellow travelers instinctively avoid someone whose face carries the marks of guilt and desperation. Even strangers can sense that you're fleeing something terrible, though they don't know what. Mari proves to be exactly what you'd hoped: a cosmopolitan trading center where money talks louder than reputation and where questions about the past are considered impolite. You rent a small room near the harbor district and begin the slow process of rebuilding your life around a new identity: a merchant trader specializing in textiles and precious stones. The transition is harder than you'd anticipated. 2 years of thinking about people primarily in terms of their economic value has warped your ability to form normal relationships. You find yourself automatically calculating the market worth of everyone you meet, imagining how much they might bring at auction if they were captured and enslaved. These thoughts horrify you, but they occur so automatically that suppressing them requires constant effort. Your attempts at legitimate business are hampered by your moral confusion about commerce in general. Having spent years in a trade where cheating customers was standard practice, you struggle to understand the ethical boundaries of normal merchant activity. When is aggressive negotiated acceptable? And when does it become exploitation? How much can you conceal about a product's flaws before honest salesmanship becomes fraud? The nightmares that began during your final weeks as a slave trader intensify rather than fade. You're haunted by dreams of faces: the pregnant woman's look of betrayal, the little girl who reminded you of your sister, the metal worker's hopeless stare when you encountered him on a construction project. Sometimes you wake up screaming apologies to people who can't hear you because they're dead, enslaved, or simply too far away to matter. Sleep becomes so elusive that you resort to drinking yourself unconscious most nights. But alcohol only makes the dreams more vivid and the guilt more overwhelming. You begin to understand why so many former slave traders end up dead in gutters or floating face down in rivers. The psychological damage from the profession is often terminal, and suicide starts to seem like a reasonable solution to problems that can't be solved any other way. But gradually, very gradually, You begin to encounter people who offer glimpses of redemption, a temple priest who works with refugees from border raids, a merchant who refuses to trade in goods produced by slave labor, a former slave who somehow managed to buy his freedom and now helps others escape bondage. These people don't know your history, but their examples suggest that moral rehabilitation might be possible for someone willing to spend the rest of his life earning it. The first step toward redemption proves to be the hardest: honest accounting of the damage you've caused. Using your knowledge of the slave trade and your records from 2 years of transactions, you begin documenting every person you sold, every family you helped destroy, every life you commodified for profit. The list grows longer than you'd expected and makes for reading that leaves you physically ill. But documenting the damage also reveals opportunities for partial restitution. Some of the slaves you sold are still alive and still in Lagash. A few might be purchased and freed if you're willing to spend most of your remaining gold on their liberation rather than your own comfort. It won't undo the harm you've caused, but it might represent a beginning towards something resembling justice. Sweet dreams, merchant of misery. Your story ended not with redemption, but with the recognition that some sins are too vast for any individual to fully atone for, and that the systems that create monsters like you will continue long after particular monsters have been destroyed. The slave trade you participated in still echoes through history today, a reminder that treating human beings as property corrupts not just the enslaved, but the enslavers. Not just individuals, but entire societies. The techniques you learned for breaking people's spirits, the markets you served, the legal structures that protected your business, all of these evolved and spread until they touched every corner of the world. You discovered what every generation must learn anew, that ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil when the incentives are right and the alternatives seem impossible. Your transformation from an idealistic young man seeking his fortune to a broken exile, haunted by guilt, shows how thin the line is between civilization and barbarism, and how easily that line can be crossed when survival is at stake. And tomorrow the sun will rise over new markets where human dignity is still for sale, where other desperate people will make the same choices you made, and where the eternal struggle between profit and conscience will play out again with fresh victims and familiar endings.